Wow.
We'll share it. That's okay.
Okay, I think we can get started. Shall we? Wow, this is like sitting in a church bench or something. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. We know there is a lot of competition out there in terms of panels, so it always feels good when the room is decently full. Thanks for being here and for our panel on rethinking leadership. I'm sorry, my voice is a bit, the weather, I didn't expect that weather, so I got a bit of a cold now. I hope my voice will carry through the next hour. Let's see, otherwise you guys have to take over the moderation as well. So welcome to the panel on rethinking leadership. I'm excited to have some of my friends here who are in very different leadership roles in very different organizations. So I think that will hopefully make for a great discussion. So next to me is Jane Barrett, the Global Head of Multimedia at Reuters. Hello, Jane. Next to her, Konrad Weber, who is the Head of Digital Strategy at the Swiss public broadcaster SRF. Hi, Konrad.
Hello.
And next to him, Shazna Nessa, who is the Chief Visuals Editor at the Wall Street Journal. Hi, Shazna. And my name is Anita Zielina, and I run executive programs at the Newmark J-School in New York at CUNY University. So I think when we started preparing this panel, one thing that struck us is that all of us, like maybe several people in the room here as well, have leadership roles that wouldn't have existed in that way 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. So all of our roles involve some kind of interdisciplinary work with both the tech side of things, the business side, the editorial side. So a lot of interdisciplinary teams. All of our roles have a lot of, let's say, dotted lines, lateral leadership. So it's not very clear hierarchically. So like the old-fashioned idea of, well, you know, this is the boss and this is what we're doing. So all of us have some, and used to have some roles that involve horizontally kind of managing relationships. And I think the one uniting factor is also that all of us work in some capacity on transformation and change. So what we wanted to talk about today is the aspects of leadership in this transformation process and how we think that leadership is evolving or has to evolve in newsrooms that are in this transformation phase. So maybe let's kick it off with the discussion of, with the question of how do you think leadership is changing and has to change in newsrooms in this transformation period? Would you like to start us off?
Really small question.
Oh yeah.
I think just to take it up to the sort of the very high level, digital is changing absolutely everything. It changes the way that we work, the way that we think, the way that we interact, and now indeed the way that we lead as well. And one of the things that I've really noticed in my career is that we've moved from a very linear command and control structure where there was a classic career ladder and people came in at the bottom and they worked really hard to take each step up. And they would look up the rungs to see what they needed to learn and how they needed to develop in order to be promoted and to get higher up in the organization. And nowadays, that linear model has been totally transformed into a very digital model, so much more of a networked model. So rather than climbing up a ladder, you're moving between different nodes of the network all the time. And that requires a really different approach to work. It requires different personal skills. It requires different relationship skills. And you get to the point where you look 2 rungs above you and you think, what got that person there isn't going to get me there. It's a totally different paradigm. So it puts a lot more emphasis on influence rather than command and control. It puts a lot more onus on the individual to lead and to have vision even in the middle of an organization rather than waiting for direction from the top. And it requires just a huge amount of very sort of management consultancy type word, but a lot more stakeholder management. You've got to deal with so many other different people. When I was the business editor, I could tell the team, right, we need to do this, you know, Joe, you're on that story, and Tom, you're on that story, and Pandora, you're on that story. And that's just not the way that this works. As Anita was saying, I have to work with my colleagues who work in product, and I have absolutely no say over their roadmap and no say over their performance. Ditto with sales, ditto with editorial. And so you're kind of bridging across so much that you become one of those nodes in a network rather than sort of working up and down. I think that's kind of writ large, that's the big change.
Great, thanks. Konrad?
Yeah. I think I can just build up on that, and I would say that leadership in digital also is way more than just thinking on little control things or little decisions you have to take. It's much more a bigger thing, thinking about the whole holistic approach maybe also, and I will even make it a little bit harder than to say in a really good digital leader, in the end, he should just abolish his own role in the end. So he really should have the aim that for himself or herself, he isn't that important for the whole organization than what he's maybe lining for the bigger discussion and not only for the small amount of control. So it's all about empowering others and also maybe letting them growing and also giving them some space, some safe space to really build them up and instead of building his or her own field of power up.
Good point.
I can build on that. I keep telling my boss, you don't need me. You don't need me. Okay, you need me now, but my job is that you do not need me because this will all be fixed. To build on both of what you have said, I think one thing that strikes me a lot is how much time I spend fixing things that are adjacent to me. So I oversee a very big team of developers, designers, producers. They're all journalists. They all have different skills, cartographers, all kinds of things. But it's not just about keeping them motivated and empowering them. I have to fix the world around them and the world around them and the world around them, because it's a bit like a systems game. It's like we're an ecosystem. So I cannot just be about me. It has to be about the whole picture. And to me, that's just like really hard. It's super, super hard. But at the same time, helping other people see that, like you can't just do your thing. I'm really sorry. You've got to go and fix this other thing that has nothing to do with you, or so you think. Mm-hmm. So I think just like navigating an ecosystem and having to repair. You repair your thing and you have to keep repairing the world around it. Mm. So I think it's a big change management job as well. Yeah.
That's a really good point. And maybe let's stay with this working with the ecosystem and driving that transformation and talk a little bit about that. Let's share some, kind of concrete, specific examples of experiences you guys had in driving that change and managing transformation. What worked, what didn't work? Are there some learnings, some experiences you can share, things that maybe you learned on kind of your leadership journey about leading that change?
Should we go down the line again? So many examples, it's hard to know which one to choose, really. But I think one of the really interesting developments that I've seen at Reuters over the last couple of years is how we have moved the newsroom and our sales organization much, much closer together. And it was something that we knew that we needed to do because we, as the newsroom, needed to get really close to the digital customer to understand what it was that they needed. And what we found was that the majority of our relationships were still with the more traditional customers, so the TV broadcasters or the newspaper managers. And so we started working together to go out and to meet digital editors, social media editors, people who are working on sort of new formats, mobile apps and the like. And we had to find our way. It was very, very different going out as a multidisciplinary team. And we made some mistakes along the way. We probably didn't make the best of our first few opportunities. But it was really interesting because that gave me much more of an insight into the more product mindset of test and iterate. You know, create something, try it, okay, that worked, that didn't, let's go back, let's redesign it, and just work on a much faster sort of turnaround of not waiting to get everything right. I think that's, for me, one of the great learnings was that as a journalist and as an editor, I would go and report a story, or I'd have my team go and report a story, and I'd go through it line by line, making sure that all the facts are right, and only when I was convinced it was perfect would I hit go. And when you're doing these sort of multidisciplinary things and you're having to lead transformation, you can't wait until you have all the answers, because by that stage, everything will have changed and you're going to have to start again. So I think that was one of the really big learnings, and it's just been such a delight working with colleagues and bringing out new things in each other. I've learned so much from so many of my colleagues, and they're kind enough to say that they've learned from me. And I think that truly we're just a much stronger team, and we're a much more forward-focused team as a result of working together rather than working in our silos.
Great point.
I was also part of quite the same change management project at Swiss Public Broadcaster, where we planned to bring online and television reporting together, and that was during the last 2 years. It was a big, huge change for the whole organization, and there it was quite the same. So we tried from the more digital perspective to persuade the colleagues from television, for example, to change their behavior and how they plan, how they distribute their stories. And in the end, it was quite hard, because it was really, we tried to convince them and to explain them how they have to work in future, and it didn't work because they had to feel and know it on their own in the end. So that was quite a big learning also for me from my side, that it's more about maybe bringing people together. It's more like sort of lobbying for an idea, so they can test it, they can feel it on their own, and then it's like bringing them some space that they really can do some sort of those learnings on their own than just to push them in a certain direction.
I think from a very sort of personal development perspective, I think something that really helped transform me is I'm British, but I've lived in America for a very long time. And I remember getting my first very big role, and I sort of inherited a really big team. And I remember like 2 weeks later, my boss took me aside and said, "Shazna, you're British, right? You're different. You grew up differently than us." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I want you to be aware of how you are perceived." I'm like, "What?" Basically, he was telling me I had to adapt my style to the context in which I was operating, and that was corporate America. And I was really mortified when he told me that. I was kind of like, well, that's really personal, asshole, yes.
You got the American in.
I know, right? But it was actually the best advice anybody ever gave me, because what he was saying is, you're wishy-washy, you're non-confrontational, you just say, when you don't understand something, you say you don't understand it. You just got to pretend you understand it. So he was basically just telling me, you're in a different context, and you have to adapt to this context. That doesn't mean change, be yourself, but be aware of it. And I think it's really transformed me. I think I'm a lot more direct now. I still say sorry all the time, but I think there was a book that came out, somebody wrote, called Radical Candor, right? Yeah. So that being very, very honest is actually, in that personal way, can be transformational. So I try and also do that with my own team. So I'm trying to be very, very honest with them. But sometimes it can hurt, but it's good. It's good to help people understand the world they're around and how they're perceived. So I think for me that was really transformational.
That's such a great point. And maybe to build on that and talk about communication a bit more, one thing that personally struck me, and that is something that really through my different leadership roles I kind of learned more and more, is how how core the concept of communicating the transformation process is to the success or potential success of the process. And one thing that I really learned over the years is when I felt that I had already communicated like 700 times why we are doing this, why are we doing this, what is the big strategic goal, how are we hopefully going to get there, and I felt like a broken record already. Someone was kind of raising their hand and saying, so thank you for sharing that. What are we exactly doing? And I'm like, oh my God, did I not kind of express my ideas properly and the strategy that we are working on? But one thing about communication is you feel you communicated the transformation process and the change and the strategy efficiently, and you feel like everyone, it should kind of ended up being clear, but it is never clear. So there is really no way of communicating too much. And another thing, and maybe you have diverging opinions on that, and that would be interesting to hear, but one thing that I've found is that so often media companies are really bad in communicating that change internally, which is kind of weird because they are, communication businesses. At least that's what I found. I don't know if you had similar experience. Awesome.
Yeah, no, say it once, everyone got it immediately. It's so true. I mean, we were laughing when I was in the throes of the sort of the big piece of transformation. I'd put out a weekly email, and it was really interesting because so many people would say, "Oh, I love the fact you send out a weekly email. It's fantastic." And then the same person would come back and ask me a question that had been answered in the previous weekly email. And you'd say, but it was in the weekly email that you said that you'd read. And you said, oh no, I just know that they come through, so it just keeps multimedia in my mind. But I'll go back and check it now. And so we did an open rate check on these emails, and they were kind of getting like between 8 and 10% open rate. And so even though you're putting stuff out all the time, you're speaking to super busy people who have their noses to the grindstone, who are trying to keep the lights on, who are just trying to get through every single day. And I agree, I mean, it can feel incredibly frustrating. But actually, I think as a leader, and I think this has always been true of leadership, I don't think this is just because of digital transformation. I think good leaders are always listening and they're always communicating. And as an empathetic leader, you have to understand where the question is coming from. Is it coming from a point of ignorance because they literally have never heard you say this before? Is it coming from a point of cynicism that they've heard you say it, but they simply don't believe it, and they think that you're either lying to them or you're not telling them the whole truth? Is it coming from a place of fear where what they're really asking is, do I still have a job at the end of this transformation? And I think using your empathy to hear why people aren't hearing really then helps you to get the message across when they finally do hear it. Because I think just being that broken record and saying the same thing again and again and again can become a little draining, and people don't think that there's any substance behind it. At the same time, I do think that you need to sort of anchor your communication in some really clear pieces of information that you do keep focusing on. So for us, for example, it was all about, digital is happening, we need to change. It's a very, very clear message. And also, it's client-led, it's not us-led. And I think just kind of getting those core messages across helped to take away lots of the extraneous fluff. But at the same time, it did need a much more personal approach and a sort of, a more tailored approach. Yeah.
I would also build on that what you said at the end, because I think there are like two answers to this question. The one thing is that in most transformation projects or transformation phases, leaders still want to say what people have to do. So it's maybe more also a change in the communication more on the why we have to do it and why it's important, so everyone on itself can also build up on this why and build his own maybe solution to that, of course in a certain frame of this change. But I still hear a lot of discussions about the what we will do in future and whatever, and that's maybe also the point why it doesn't come to the end. And On the other side, it's also maybe a point of the old world clashing the new world, so that it's still some sort of a one-to-many communication. So one person thinks about one solution or his own solution, and then wants to like preach this solution to employees, and that's maybe also something which has to change. So it's more about collaboration and inclusion, also by finding this solution.
Yeah.
I think the why is really important. In newsrooms, everyone's very skeptical, very cynical. So I think evidence is always really good to build a message, collecting data, and not even just quantitative information, but also qualitative. I think is really important. I think explaining outcomes is really important as well, rather than waffling about the activities you have to do. Here's where we need to get. Here's why. So I actually recently was asked to do a 360 evaluation. If you're familiar with 360, it's a it's like a survey where about 30 people in your organization rank you on all these different factors and then provide comments. And it's quite terrifying when you receive the results. And there's actually a coping mechanism model called the SARA model, and you start by being devastated, and you start down here on this curve, and then by the end you're like, okay, perception is real. And I think the first thing that, the biggest takeaway I got from it is that my team is like, they want more communication. They feel I don't communicate enough with them, and I think I do, but if they feel that, then I have to figure out what that is. I'm trying to avoid meetings. I don't want more meetings. I don't want to send newsletters. Nobody reads emails. So I have to figure that one out. And I think some of it is actually helping my direct reports be better at it themselves, because they actually need to trickle that information down. And I suddenly realized, one of my managers, she wasn't having regular meetings with her reports. It was just on-the-fly communication in stressful news situations. So I was like, maybe you need to have a one-on-one every 2 weeks with everybody on your team and help them when we're not in crisis mode. So communication is important. I don't have the answer for it because it's so hard, because there's so much going on, and I work in a very, very big organization. I have like over 100 people reporting into my department, and so if you have ideas, I'd like to know.
But I think it's the most biggest problem is that we still talk about content all day long. So we, rather than discussing also processes and how maybe some sort of how you do this sort of content affects you in your daily life. So we try to start with some sort of retros as a team in our organization. So we talk about maybe once monthly or all 2 months we discuss a whole afternoon how we work together rather than just what we are working on. And I think that's also something which has to change in the head of the whole organization, but also in the head of the people in this organization.
I think the other real challenge with communication is the fact that particularly in the world of digital transformation, things are changing all the time. And so what you say in February might look very different by May. And people don't like that. They sort of tend to think, but in February you said this. And you're like, yeah, I know, but things have changed. And to my mind, again, and it comes back to what Konrad was just saying, like, we're so busy doing the news. And boy, oh boy, has it just been an insane news cycle for the last God knows how many years now. That actually people are so concentrated on getting the stuff done, and getting the stories out and doing the great reporting and doing the great journalism that we're paying them to do, that you can kind of almost bewilder them as well, right? And so you have to somewhat gently take them through what's happening in the industry and be their guide and sort of say, it's okay, I'm paid to do this bit, and I'll help you when that's relevant to you. But I'm also really keen that you still have a job and that we're still in business and that you can still do what you love doing. Because you don't want everyone suddenly being a transformation queen, because otherwise we'd get nothing done.
And the interesting thing is, and I mean, I agree with all the points you brought, and I think one thing that happens is if you don't prioritize communication, and if you don't prioritize discussions around culture, they are just not going to happen, because magically, and we all know that, magically our Google calendars fill with meetings that are around the content part, that are around, kind of very specific parts of our jobs. So if you don't really make the conscious effort to say, well, we're going to take that time, we're going to discuss processes, we're going to discuss roles, we're going to discuss structure, we're going to discuss cultural issues, it's not happening kind of automatically. The thing that happens automatically is the content part, because that is like, that is a machine that needs to be fed constantly. But I feel like I think I didn't always do a perfect job in that prioritization, but it helped when I had teams where we were transparent in saying, well, we all constantly suck at prioritizing that, but we should do it better. So I felt transparency, and Konrad, you brought that up as well before. Transparency and seeing teams as, a place where you also share, well, we are all not perfect in driving that transformation. I felt that is something helpful. We talked about good leadership now, so let's move to the ugly side. Let's talk a little bit about bad leadership, because I think one thing that many people will agree with is that there is bad leadership in media. I'm not saying any names, and I'm not calling out any organizations, but I think every one of us encountered in whatever capacity bad leaders, people who were just not good in managing others, people who were not reflective of their own leadership style, people who don't communicate in a appreciative and productive way. Question 1, why do we still have that in the media industry? Question 2, how do we change that? The small problem. We're just like diving deep into the small problem that we want to tackle.
We know that, what is it called, the Peter principle, where you get so good at one thing that you just keep getting promoted into roles that you're not actually suitable for. So I think it's very common in our industry that you become, you go from being a journalist to an editor to suddenly like managing 100 people and running a business. And we don't really provide support for people. I also think, to our point earlier, we don't have to be in these we're not in these same net systems anymore. We're in a much more networked world. You don't need to be a manager. A lot of my team say, I want to, I'm thinking about my career and I want to be a manager. I'm like, you want to be a manager? You want to like approve vacations and timesheets? Is that really what you want to do? You're so creative. I think you can be really good at what you do, and you don't have to be a manager. You can, because you're going to be a terrible manager. But I will support you and I will help you. But I think we just get promoted to things that we're not good at, and we don't then support people. So I think that's one of the things. And then I also think the pressure to, like, you're thinking you're on a career path, and that the career path we're thinking of is still very old-fashioned.
I'd agree. I think, managing people is a real skill. And I think people see it as a prize for doing their job really well, rather than thinking that it's a totally different skill base that they now have to learn. And this isn't necessarily a plug for your new course, but you have to learn to be a really good manager. I think you can have natural management skills, you can have natural leadership skills, from when you're knee-high to a grasshopper. But you need to develop those skills. And I think we're very good in newsrooms at developing people's journalistic skills. And I think we're getting better at developing their management skills. But I do think that we have to, as the leaders and as the managers, we have to determine, what do we value? And, I value journalistic excellence, and I agree with Shazna. Like, there are some people who are brilliant journalists at Reuters who should never have to manage even their own diary, let alone anybody else's. And they can't manage their own diary, let alone anyone else's. So I think it's accepting that there are skills you need, then sort of training people in those skills, but also then sort of creating new career paths for the people who just shouldn't manage, and who would be bad managers.
Can I want to add to that, like, I've worked very hard around compensation so that you don't have to be a manager to be compensated at that level, right? We should have compensation bands that promote people for their talent, not necessarily because they're a manager or they're not a manager. So I think that's one of the ways you create a path for very talented people.
I think I see it quite similar. So it's more, also, or especially in Europe, it's the problem of not having some sort of a system like a senior editor place for people who are really good in content but bad in process and managing people, so that they still have some sort of place where they can do their job and not just have to be a manager in the end, because they are like 20 years in their organization and they have to grow up some sort of a way. And on the other side, I think there's a problem because you still cannot get some sort of appreciation, maybe also from the media industry, by building good processes. It's more about content, it's more about, or all about the big stories and everything around that, but you less, or maybe more and more, you'd also discuss about the process behind that and how you managed it to get to this point, but still in the forefront there is still the thing about what you see outside of the organization, and that's maybe also a problem. So we should more talk about how you could strengthen maybe as a leader another person, or how you could step back in a certain situation, so that this should be like more the focus also on some public discussions.
Like Jane mentioned, that the programs that I'm building at CUNY now are really geared towards leaders in news that want to be better at driving that transformation process, because I don't see that there are many programs like that out there. Now, the interesting thing is that all of us here have done some kind of continuing education that dealt with some aspects of leadership. So I just briefly want to talk about that and ask the question of what did we take from it. So you both, Shazna and Jane, did the Salzburger program. You did a master at Hyper Island, Digital Transformation, I think was the title, or Digital
Management.
Yeah, Digital Management, and I did an executive MBA that had nothing to do with media as a whole. But let's just briefly dive into what did these programs do for you? What was kind of a takeaway? And do you think that these are potential paths for future leaders to kind of take on more responsibility?
You're good. I think in my education at Hyper Island, it was all about reflection and giving feedback, learning how to give feedback, also how about learning if a person is open to receive feedback. That's also a very important point. And it wasn't really it wasn't mentioned like that, but it was like underlining the whole curriculum, in fact, that we always built new groups, we always had to work with new people and building new team culture, and that's a big point which I could take back also to my workplace, and I think that's the most important point also, that in journalism schools is still not really discussed at the moment.
Yes, so I did if you're familiar with the Salzburger Fellowship, it's, I think it was started around 2006, and it was like a mini MBA type thing for executives and newsrooms, and my boss did it the year before me. I did it in 2008, so it's a long time ago now. But it was really, in hindsight, totally changed me. In the moment, I was like, what the hell am I doing there? This is so boring. I'm like in the ashram. Who are these people? It was basically, it was run by...
They changed it by the time I got there.
It was run by, well, the program had become very popular. I think I was like the third class. But it was run by these gentlemen who are McKinsey consultants. So, you know, if you're in a newsroom, you run from McKinsey consultants, because that usually means something bad is about to happen. So it was very dry, and it was all about business, really. less about leadership, really about how you run a business and how you manage change. That was the big important thing for me, because managing change is not sexy. It sucks. It's hard. It's actually, in the moment, just drudgery. It's not fun. But I got really good at it. And I started getting anxious at one point, like, when I die, what's going to be on my gravestone? She was a really good change manager. I really need to like write a book or something and change that narrative. But that program was really good because, I also did the Stanford Fellowship that Anita also did. And Silicon Valley is very different. It's not about change. It's just more like brute force. We're going to like build technology. Technology is going to solve everything. It's not about implementation. It's not about, it's not about taking something from A to B in a sustained way. So I think it was really complementary to have this really dry implementation program, and then later go to Stanford, which is more sexy, right? You got Post-it notes, and you get to like do improv and
sit in the Californian sun. That also helps.
Yeah, but I think that the really dry, hard stuff was way, way, way more valuable to me than any of those design thinking classes I ever did. I actually have a note here, like, a few things. Like, there was this one very simple thing that you can all do all the time, that I do all the time, and it helps me. And you probably remember this. Like Doug, who runs the program, would have all these different framings of how you look at things, and he would say, where are you right now? Are you on the balcony or are you on the dance floor? And he would encourage us, think like the CEO. If you're running this organization, what are you seeing from up here? And sometimes come down to the dance floor. If you're in the mix, what are you seeing down there? And that little framework, being able to shift from the dance floor to the balcony, I do it all the time, and it's incredibly powerful in just trying to understand what people are dealing with and sort of getting out of your turf, your silos, your everything. So if you like do these fantasies where you're the CEO, 1 hour a day, it's really eye-opening.
And dancing on the balcony on its own, it's quite boring, I think.
I very much agree with what Shazna was saying, and I think, so many transformations fail because there isn't a rollout plan, and because people, you typically give the transformation to the person who has got loads of energy, loads of ideas, is a bit of a force of nature. And I think Shazna and I probably both have been accused of that in the past. And so we need process, right? So I run away from process. I just think somebody else can deal with that. And so what's been so good for me is actually having to learn the discipline of process and really learning, okay, how am I going to hold myself accountable to certain results? How am I actually going to get the rollout done? How am I going to implement this? How am I now going to spread it out and give everyone else a really clear roadmap as to where they're heading? And that was probably the hardest piece of work I've ever done in my entire life. And my colleague Jo, who's here in the audience, has had to help me do some of the rollout. And she knows it was blood, sweat, and tears, just trying to build this roadmap and actually get people to move through it. So to me, it was a lot about, learning about and celebrating my strengths, learning about and then learning to compensate for my weaknesses, which was incredibly, incredibly useful. The other thing that I would just say about doing an executive course like that was the fact that you just meet fabulous people who are your peers, and you suddenly realize you're not the only person who is actually tearing their hair out and going grayer by the second and thinking everyone hates me and just wanting to go and curl up and cry. Everyone else was also wanting to curl up and cry. And actually, we did. We just did a joint curl up and cry moment at some stage in June. And there was kind of a catharsis in understanding that you weren't alone, that this is hard. It is really, really hard to push through change. Whether you're in a small company, a big company, new company, an old company. And we had a mixture of everyone on that course. And I think, we talk a lot about resilience. How do you keep going when you're leading change? And for me, a large part of the answer was that peer group and then the coach that I had who took me through the Salzburger. We'd talk every Friday, And sometimes he'd get tears as well. But, you know, often he would also get that elation of like, yes, we punched through, that person has finally come on board, that has now happened. And actually taking an hour each week just to look at what have we achieved this week held me accountable, but also allowed me to see that things were shifting, even if it felt like it was trudging through mud.
I think that's really important, and I don't even do it enough, ever. You know, maybe once a year when my boss is doing my review, I'll be like, this year I did this. It's really good every week to get out of the weeds and look at the progress and the outcomes that have
I think there is, I completely agree, and I think there is a certain danger in becoming very lonely if you're in a leadership role that is a lot about transformation and driving the change, and you feel like you're alone, you're fighting kind of the fight against the people on top of the organization, you're fighting the fight against people resisting the change. Permanently, you have to look to the outside and see, well, why are others quicker than us in developing new things? Why are others probably more successful? So it can feel pretty lonely. So I think in whatever way, building resilience, in whatever way, building connections with others in the same situation, I think that is very helpful.
I went to a really good session yesterday on product, and one of the things they talked about was how product is so misunderstood in a newsroom, and that they're treated as service desk people, and why would a good product person want to come and work in a newsroom? And that really resonated with me, because I've always done work that's been at the margins of a newsroom. It's never ever been taken seriously, and it ought to be. So you've got this dual role of keeping people motivated while you're trying to move what you're doing into the center. But I bring this up because I went and spoke to the person on that panel afterwards, and I said, that was so great. And she said to me, well, I felt so stupid because I felt like everybody knows what I'm talking about. And number one, not everybody knew, but number two, I said, I knew, but you made me feel like I wasn't crazy. Yeah. And
that helps,
you know,
sometimes.
It's really important. And I also think another really important thing is not to get dark, not to be dragged so down. It's really, really destructive. So another exercise I try to do a lot is, what is noise and what is actually a signal? Because there is so much noise in our day-to-day world. Just how do you build the muscle to know when it's noise and know when it's actually important?
Great point.
And also on that, maybe just to see which way of noise you can really change, maybe, and which one you just have to leave it out. That's also a very important point for myself. So to really see it, where do you have to force maybe also to change something, and where you just have to leave it out.
So let's open it up to questions from the audience. I think we have a mic maybe somewhere. Yeah, okay, I see questions.
This is a really informative panel, thank you. I had a question about when you know in leadership that change is coming, and you don't know what it's going to look like yet. Do you choose to communicate that change is coming, but you don't know what it's going to look like yet, to the people that are below you? And if so, how do you do that? To not make them nervous, but to also prepare them so that they're not sideswiped by the fact that change is coming?
It's a really good question. I think you can communicate too much to put the fear of God into people, and I think we already live in such an uncertain world and in such an uncertain industry that people are already on quite shaky ground. So you don't want to add any extra waves that maybe people don't need to surf yet. On the other hand, I do think that it's such a trope now to say it, but change is such a constant. And I think people actually like to know that someone, in certain cases, people like to know that somebody's thinking about it. You know, I think we've had a problem in Reuters. You know, we're so big. It's 2,500 journalists in 160 countries around the world, in all sorts of different languages, and you can feel so far removed from the center. And I've had people get in touch with me saying, you know, did you know that, you know, people are doing voice? What are we doing in podcasts? And I'm able to say, okay, we know that voice is growing and this is what we're doing. And they're reassured that, oh, okay, fine, at least you're dealing with it. And so that's kind of more of a reactive thing, but also on the proactive thing, on the practice side of things, it's also a matter of saying, take a very big example, you know, lots of people are needing different formats. We can't do them all, but we need to look at which ones we need to do and how we need to change our file in order to better satisfy our customers. I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but I'm out there speaking to lots of customers about it, and I'll let you know when I have an answer. And it kind of just allows them to know that, in a way, yes, change is coming, but be reassured that there's actually a process around it and that somebody's in charge and is actually looking at it. So I think it depends on of course, if you've got a massive retrenchment coming, you can't exactly go around and saying, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to lose about 100 jobs next week. But, you know, I think it depends on the situation that being open can actually reassure people as well as sometimes rocking the boat.
And something that's worked for me is maybe you don't tell everyone. You figure out who are the influencers who are the influencers? Who, when it actually happens, do you need to get buy-in from now so that when it happens, they're affecting the rest of the team because they are bought in. So you might just tell 2 people and give them the background, the skinny and everything, and then when it happens, they know and they're able to be stable and to be able to bring everyone else along.
And maybe a last short one, I think it is really tricky to find kind of the sweet spot, like the right sense of creating the right sense of urgency that is kind of not too far on this extreme, where everyone is then just running around like headless chickens, basically like, oh my God, we're all gonna die, because that's not a great status to innovate. That's like panic. But on the other hand, you also don't want people to feel, oh, everything is going to be fine. We can relax. We don't have to drive the change anymore. So because that is the other bad side. So I think finding that sweet spot is really tricky, and you constantly have to navigate how far you're on the left or right of that panel.
As you say, in a media landscape where the only constant is change and where human beings typically are kind of resistant to that unless they're leading it, I would be interested to know from the panelists what you feel the common blocks are across organizations and how you're, you know, typically any best practice of breaking through those blocks.
The most important block is maybe that in the DNA of journalists, they don't want to change themselves. They always want to change others, but no, never ever themselves. That's maybe one hard point, I think, but it's also hard to change this point. I think, or I did a positive experience by bringing them to the table and that they have to build the solution together with a team, for example, that they are also part of the responsibility, and so in the end they cannot say it's a bad solution, I don't want it. So even though they have to be part a little bit of the solution in the end, if they already built on it in the beginning. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I did some positive experience with that.
I think a very common block is what we talked about earlier, in that we work in a networked way now, and I think some people still feel that they own this turf, they own this thing, and you're not allowed to, you know, it doesn't work anymore. And so trying to convince people, it really has to be done through doing. If you're like the editor of a section and you think you're the boss, like you're going to tell product how to do things, you're going to tell the engineers how to do things, where it has to be a lot more collaborative. I think collaboration is very hard because there's this romantic notion of journalism, this Byronic person on a mountain doing, you know, writing this screed that changes the world, and it's not like that anymore. There is no Lord Byron anymore. You know, we all have to work together, and it's really interesting because now with stories, it's creating so many bylines. Suddenly, like 50 people want a byline on a story. So that's been super interesting too. Like who gets their name on a story when so many people were involved in it? But that actually helps. It actually helps. Like putting people's names on things helps get their buy-in as well because they become very, very proud of it. But I do think that's a really common one in journalism. there's still this idea you're a one-person, one-woman show. You can do it all, and it's not possible.
I think there are a couple that I would add to the ones that the others have already mentioned. I think one is simply we've all got so much on, and how do you prioritize? And you were speaking about that a little bit earlier. Like, you know, how do you determine how much time you're going to spend on each thing, and be brutal about that. And then I think then the other one, which I've heard numerous times, is, well, we already do that. And there's kind of that lovely complacency of, well, why are you trying to tell me to do what I already do? And that's when data comes in, and you've actually got to bring stuff to the table and actually show people that we don't already do that, or the way that you've interpreted that needs to be rethought in a digital and new way.
And I'd add, as a last point, communication, because I really feel that I very often see a disconnect between management and the rest of the organization, and the disconnect expresses itself in leaders only communicating when there is something really bad to tell people. And if people are used that whatever communication they receive from their editor-in-chief or manager is, oh, sorry, we're going to lay off some people, or we have to, save some money, or I'm sorry, you can't do that anymore, or you have a bad performance review, then this is what you expect. And that's not a fruitful transformation discussion. That's kind of a very fearful hierarchy discussion. So building the trust in good times helps you communicate the difficult things better in worse times, I'd say. I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question about a model I've heard other founders speaking about quite passionately recently, which was about killing the boss at all, and living in their company is a model where there is no leadership team anymore. Everybody is the same. There is no balcony and no dance floor, and neither the founders have an exclusive senior level knowledge, but the team itself elects people to lead initiatives or projects on a very flexible level, and so there is a leadership by competence on a project basis, but the boss itself doesn't exist anymore. And they say the people who talked about it were very convinced that this is the model of work, the future of work, and this is how things are going to be, even in big corporates. And now you three are, I think, all working in big corporates. And Anita, you did a lot of research about leadership. Do you think that's actually there is a portion of is it realistic that this is going to happen even in bigger companies?
I don't think so. I think there is always power somewhere. I remember there was a whole trend in Silicon Valley at one point where there are apparently no bosses, like medium. I forget the name of this model. Does somebody say it? Holacracy. Yeah. It doesn't actually work. Somebody actually still has power. There are still the people within who have the power. We just say they don't, but they do. I just don't.
I think. Yeah, I totally agree. I think the one thing that I really like about it, though, is the idea of getting project teams going and sharing out leadership amongst that. Because I think one of the things that holds us back in transformation is a lack of a sense of urgency. And when you're in charge of something, boy, do you feel the urgency, because you've got to report back in 2 weeks. And I think actually democratizing that sense of urgency is really useful. One of the things that we're looking at is how can you kind of create story hubs within the newsroom. So there's a big story that we're working on, and no longer will you sit in your team where you normally sit, but you'll come together. And it's something that various other tech and retail companies have looked at. You actually have a project room, and everyone who's working on that project goes to that room, and that's where there's the lack of hierarchy, and that you're sharing out the leadership. And I think that we could probably experiment with that sort of stuff on individual projects to get stuff moving faster. But I think if you did it broadly, everything would just stop. Because, as Konrad was saying earlier, we hate process in newsrooms, but we actually need process, because otherwise we won't get paid, which everyone likes getting paid, and we won't actually have the right kit on our desks and everything else like that. So I think for big companies, you still need the process.
And I absolutely agree too on push responsibility out so everybody's participating. because one or two people don't have all the answers. Everybody as a group has the answer. But these models have been, these ideas, these romantic ideas of like a flat society have already been tested over centuries, and they just have never worked because things just revert back to well-known systems. Like, you know, we lived in Silicon Valley for a while, and communalism in Silicon Valley, where like back to the land movement, where everyone was like going in this flat society, but at the end of the day, all the same human traits kept coming out. Or you look at like Lord of the Flies, you know, you just like.
Last brief question.
Okay, so my question is to Konrad. Konrad, you talked about the holistic approach to digital and TV and digital working together. How do you see the two working together? And can you share some tips on how we can have that holistic approach going?
Big thing, but for the end. In the end, it's all about how can we tell the story in other formats and also in other way of storytelling, of course. And as we did it at SRF, at my organization, we tried to change the television people, for example, to more like multimedia journalists, so that they know already in the beginning with the planning how they can maybe tell their story for different channels in the end, and also how the different languages are spoken from these different channels. But I think that's quite the same at Reuters too. So it's all about planning and knowing the language of those channels.
Maybe you have time to chat about that afterwards as well. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to my panel, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.